Chapter 1. The Whisper of Old Walls. The Victorian house stood at the edge of the snow-dusted town, a timeless sentinel from another era. Its grand facade, though weathered by decades of neglect, still carried an aura of elegance. The gabled roof, adorned with intricate gingerbread trim, seemed to defy the years, while its bay windows, framed in frost, reflected a kaleidoscope of winter's muted light. Natalie Harrington paused at the gate, her breath curling in the crisp December air. This house, with its peeling paint and sagging porch, was her latest project, an ambitious restoration that would culminate in the town's holiday tour. But as she took her first tentative step onto the creaking path, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was more than just a relic of the past. It was a keeper of secrets. Inside, the air was tinged with the faint aroma of cedar and dust, a smell that seemed to whisper of long-forgotten winters. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its banister polished smooth by countless hands over the years. She ran her fingers along the wood, feeling the history etched into its surface. The house was alive in its own way, each creak of the floorboards and groan of the timbers a testament to the lives it had sheltered. Natalie's work began with methodical precision. She cataloged each room, making notes of what could be salvaged and what would need replacing. The parlor was a trove of potential, with its ornate fireplace and crown molding still intact. The dining room, though dim and shadowed, hinted at the grandeur of candlelit feasts from decades past. But it was in the smallest upstairs bedroom that she stumbled upon the first true glimpse of the house's soul. The room was unremarkable at first glance, a narrow space with faded wallpaper and a single, arched window. But as Natalie pushed open the closet door, a soft thud drew her attention. There, nestled in the corner, was a small wooden box. Its edges were worn smooth, and the brass latch gleamed faintly in the dim light. She lifted it carefully, her pulse quickening with an inexplicable sense of anticipation. The box was surprisingly heavy, as if it carried more than its size suggested. Settling onto the window seat, Natalie opened the lid. Inside, she found a neat stack of letters, tied together with a red satin ribbon. The paper was yellowed with age, and the edges were delicate, as though they might crumble at the slightest touch. She untied the ribbon, her hands trembling slightly, and unfolded the top letter. The handwriting was elegant, looping across the page in black ink that had faded to a soft gray. The salutation read simply, "My dearest Eleanor." The words that followed spoke of a love both profound and enduring. The letter was dated December 15th, 1943, and the writer, identified only as William, described his longing for Eleanor with a poetic intensity. He spoke of nights under foreign stars, the ache of separation, and the hope that their love would withstand the distance of both war and time. Natalie read each word with growing wonder, as if she were eavesdropping on a private moment frozen in time. She couldn't help but feel the raw emotion in the lines, a connection that transcended the decades. The next letter was equally poignant, and the one after that even more so. Each missive painted a vivid picture of a love story that had endured trials Natalie could scarcely imagine. Yet the letters left as many questions as they answered. Who was Eleanor, and what had become of her? Did William survive the war, and had their love story reached its promised conclusion? As the snow began to fall more heavily outside, casting a silvery glow across the room, Natalie realized she couldn't leave these questions unanswered. That evening, she brought the box of letters downstairs and placed it on the dining table. The house, now illuminated by the soft glow of vintage light fixtures, seemed to exude a quiet expectancy, as though it, too, awaited the unraveling of its mysteries. Natalie spread the letters across the table, arranging them in chronological order. The timeline spanned nearly 2 years, with the last letter dated October 1945. It ended abruptly, with no farewell or resolution. The discovery of the letters transformed Natalie's project. Restoring the house was no longer just about sanding floors and repainting walls. It was about preserving the intangible essence of its history. The whispers of the old walls had taken on a voice, urging her to dig deeper. She spent hours poring over the letters, tracing the arc of William and Eleanor's story. But as the days passed, she realized she needed help. Someone with the expertise to uncover the identities behind the names, to breathe life into the faded ink. It was then that Natalie thought of the town historian, Liam Everett. She had met him briefly during a community event, where his passion for local lore had been evident in every word he spoke. If anyone could help her piece together the fragments of this love story, it was him. And so, with the letters carefully repacked in their wooden box, Natalie resolved to seek him out. Little did she know, the journey they were about to embark on would intertwine not only the lives of William and Eleanor, but their own as well. The Victorian house, standing silent beneath its blanket of snow, seemed to approve. Its secrets, long buried, were finally beginning to emerge, carried on the whispers of its old walls. Chapter 2. Secrets Beneath the Floorboards. The snow had deepened overnight, cloaking the Victorian house in an ethereal silence. Natalie arrived early the next morning, the crunch of her boots breaking the pristine stillness of the front yard. She carried the wooden box of letters tucked under one arm, her mind still preoccupied with the emotions they had stirred. The weight of William's words and the mystery of Eleanor's fate lingered with her like a haunting melody. Once inside, Natalie took a moment to appreciate the stillness. The house seemed warmer today, though the radiators groaned and clanked in protest against the winter chill. The scent of wood polish mingled with the faint aroma of old plaster, and Natalie imagined the many mornings this house had seen in its lifetime. Today, however, was different. Today, the house felt alive, as if it had woken from a long slumber. Determined to make progress, she headed to the library. The room had been a favorite of the house's former owners, judging by the shelves built into the walls and the faint impressions of chairs on the faded rug. The space had a certain charm, though years of neglect had left it in disarray. Piles of books leaned precariously, their spines faded but still legible. Some were classics, while others were obscure titles that spoke to the eclectic tastes of those who had lived here before. Natalie began sorting through the books, pulling out the ones that had succumbed to mildew and stacking the rest in neat piles. As she worked, she imagined the lives that had unfolded in this room. Did Eleanor and William ever sit by the window, reading letters to each other in the soft glow of lamplight? Or had this room become a refuge for Eleanor after William's departure, a place where she could lose herself in the words of others to escape the weight of her own? It was while rearranging a particularly stubborn shelf that Natalie noticed something unusual. One of the floorboards near the hearth seemed slightly out of place, its edges uneven and its surface worn smoother than the others. Intrigued, she knelt and ran her fingers along the board, feeling the grooves and imperfections. It wobbled faintly under her touch. She fetched a flathead screwdriver from her toolkit and carefully pried the board loose. Beneath the floorboard was a small, hollow compartment. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in cloth, its fabric frayed and brittle with age. Natalie's pulse quickened as she lifted it out, her movements reverent as if she were handling a sacred artifact. She unfolded the cloth to reveal another collection of letters, though these were fewer in number and bound with a simple string. Alongside the letters was a tarnished locket, its chain tangled and its clasp stuck. Natalie held the locket up to the light, brushing away a layer of grime with her thumb. The front was engraved with a delicate floral design, and when she finally managed to open it, she found a sepia photograph inside. It depicted a young woman with soft features and a contemplative expression. Natalie's heart gave a small lurch. She felt certain this was Eleanor. There was a timeless elegance about her, a quiet strength that seemed to echo through the years. Turning her attention back to the letters, Natalie untied the string and carefully unfolded the first one. The handwriting was the same elegant script she'd seen in the earlier letters, but this time the words were written in haste, as if penned under duress. William's words spoke of a looming departure, a mission too dangerous to describe in detail. He urged Eleanor to keep the locket close and to remember that no matter what happened, his love for her was eternal. The letter ended abruptly, with ink smudges hinting at a rushed farewell. The remaining letters were shorter, fragments of thoughts and emotions scrawled hastily on scraps of paper. They painted a picture of a man caught between duty and desire, his love for Eleanor battling the harsh realities of war. Natalie felt the weight of William's struggle, his words like echoes of a time she could scarcely imagine. These letters seemed to end even more abruptly than the first set, as though William's voice had been suddenly silenced. Natalie placed the letters and locket back into the cloth bundle, her thoughts swirling. The discovery deepened the mystery, adding layers to a story that was already intricate and compelling. Why had these letters been hidden beneath the floorboards? Had Eleanor placed them there? Or had someone else sought to protect them from prying eyes? And most importantly, what had become of William and Eleanor after these final, desperate words were exchanged? The days slipped by in a haze of speculation and restoration work. Natalie found herself glancing often at the box of letters and the bundle from the floorboards, as if their presence anchored her to the house's past. By late afternoon, she realized she needed more information. The names William and Eleanor were not enough to uncover their story. She needed context, records, something to tie these fragments to the larger tapestry of history. She decided to visit the town archives, a modest building tucked away on Main Street. It was there that she hoped to find Liam Everett, the historian whose reputation for uncovering hidden stories was well known in the community. Natalie's resolve grew as she imagined the possibility of piecing together the puzzle. The house, with its whispers and secrets, had drawn her into its orbit, and she felt compelled to honor the love story that had unfolded within its walls. As she locked up for the day, the snow began to fall again, blanketing the house in a fresh layer of white. The windows glowed softly, the light within casting faint shadows onto the drifts outside. Natalie stood for a moment, watching the snowflakes dance in the twilight. She felt a connection to the house that went beyond her role as a restorer. It was as if the house had chosen her, entrusting her with its story and its secrets. That night, as she sat by the fire in her own home, the locket resting in her palm and the letters spread out before her, Natalie's thoughts returned to Eleanor. She imagined her pacing the library floor, clutching William's letters, her heart heavy with longing and uncertainty. Natalie vowed to uncover the truth, not just for her own curiosity, but for the sake of the love story that deserved to be remembered. The house's secrets, hidden beneath the floorboards, were waiting to be revealed, and Natalie was determined to bring them to light. Chapter 3. A Box of Forgotten Promises. The morning sun cast a pale light over the town, its rays barely piercing through the thick veil of clouds. Natalie arrived at the archives with the box of letters and the locket nestled securely in her satchel. The building, with its red brick exterior and arched windows, stood as a quiet monument to the town's collective memory. As she stepped inside, the musty scent of aged paper and ink enveloped her, a stark contrast to the crispness of the winter air outside. Natalie's footsteps echoed softly on the polished wooden floors as she made her way to the research desk. Her heart raced with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. She placed the box on the desk, its worn edges and brass latch gleaming faintly under the overhead lights. The letters and the locket were more than artifacts to her now. They were pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. The archivist, a petite woman with silver hair and glasses perched precariously on her nose, greeted Natalie with a polite nod. After a brief explanation of her discovery, Natalie requested access to records that might help identify William and Eleanor. Birth certificates, census data, military enlistments, anything that could connect the names in the letters to the town's history. The archivist, intrigued by the romantic undertones of Natalie's quest, promised to assist in any way she could. Natalie was directed to a long wooden table in a quiet corner, where she began sifting through stacks of old newspapers and ledgers. Each page she turned felt like peeling back a layer of time. The articles and records painted a vivid picture of life in the 1940s. Wartime rationing, community events, and the names of young men who had gone off to fight. As she delved deeper, the letters' words lingered in her mind, their poignancy shaping the way she viewed the era. Hours passed, marked only by the faint ticking of a wall clock. Natalie's eyes burned from reading the small, faded print, but her determination never wavered. At last, she stumbled upon a name that sent a jolt of recognition through her. William Harrison. The article was dated February 1944 and detailed the enlistment of local men into the Army. Beside William's name was a brief mention of his fiancée, Eleanor Whitaker. Natalie's breath caught. She read the lines again, her fingers tracing the faded text as if she could pull the story from the page. William and Eleanor had been real people, their lives entwined with the town's history. But the article offered little beyond the barest details, leaving more questions than answers. What had happened to them after William's enlistment? Had they married? Or had the war kept them apart? As the afternoon light began to wane, the archivist approached with a stack of military records. She had located a service file for William Harrison, noting that he had been stationed overseas for most of the war. The records detailed his assignments and movements, including a period of time in Europe during the latter half of 1944. But they ended abruptly, with no indication of what had become of him after the war's conclusion. Natalie's frustration grew as she pored over the documents. The threads of William and Eleanor's story were tantalizingly close, yet still out of reach. She glanced at the box of letters, the locket resting atop the worn-wood like a beacon. The photograph inside seemed to plead with her, its sepia tones capturing a moment frozen in time. Eleanor's eyes, steady and filled with quiet strength, seemed to hold the answers Natalie sought. Determined not to leave empty-handed, Natalie turned her attention to Eleanor. The Whitaker name was prominent in the town's history, tied to one of the older farming families in the area. Another round of research led Natalie to an obituary from 1951. Eleanor Whitaker, survived by her parents and siblings, passed away at the age of 30. Natalie's heart sank. The words blurred on the page as she tried to process them. Eleanor had died young, her life cut short before she could see the full arc of her story. But the obituary made no mention of William, nor did it hint at the circumstances of Eleanor's passing. Had she and William been separated by the war? Had their love story ended in heartbreak? The archivist, sensing Natalie's discouragement, suggested she take the search to the next level. Sometimes, she said gently, answers aren't found in records alone. People's memories are just as valuable. She mentioned a local historical society that might have personal accounts or oral histories from families who had lived in the area during the 1940s. Encouraged by the idea, Natalie resolved to visit the society the following day. That evening, Natalie returned to the Victorian house, the weight of her discoveries pressing heavily on her. The house seemed to greet her with its familiar creaks and whispers, the warmth of its interior a balm against the chill of the evening. She carried the box of letters up to the library, where she placed it carefully on the desk. The locket, now polished to reveal its intricate engraving, rested beside it. Natalie lit a fire in the hearth and settled into a worn armchair, the flickering light casting shadows across the room. She opened the box and began rereading the letters, this time with the knowledge of William and Eleanor's identities adding depth to their words. Each line felt heavier, as if the weight of their unfulfilled promises had settled into her own heart. As the flames crackled and the snow began to fall outside, Natalie's resolve hardened. The story of William and Eleanor was far from over. The house, with its secrets and its whispers, had chosen her to uncover the truth, and she would not stop until she had pieced together the fragments of their love, no matter how elusive the answers might be. The promise of the letters, forgotten for so long, would be fulfilled at last. Chapter 4: Threads of Time. The morning dawned in muted tones, the sky a canvas of soft grays. Natalie awoke with a renewed sense of purpose, though the weight of her discoveries so far lingered. The story of William and Eleanor felt more like a haunting than a history, a love story that refused to fade, demanding resolution. Today, her search would take her to the town's historical society, a modest building tucked behind the courthouse and known for its collection of oral histories and artifacts. The society's entrance was marked by a wooden plaque engraved with the words "Preserving our past for future generations." Inside, the scent of aged books mingled with the faint tang of lemon polish. Shelves lined the walls, filled with binders, journals, and artifacts, a treasure trove of stories waiting to be rediscovered. The quiet hum of a radiator underscored the room's stillness as Natalie approached the desk where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes greeted her. After a brief explanation of her project, the woman introduced herself as Margaret, the society's curator. She listened intently as Natalie recounted the details of William and Eleanor's letters and her discoveries so far. Margaret's expression shifted to one of intrigue, her gaze lighting up as Natalie described the locket and its hidden photograph. Margaret disappeared into the back room, returning moments later with a stack of binders. "These contain interviews with some of the older families in town," she explained, sliding the stack onto the table where Natalie had settled. "Many of them spoke about life during the war. You might find something helpful here." Natalie spent the next several hours immersed in the handwritten pages and typewritten transcripts. The voices of the past came alive in the words of those who had lived through it, their stories painting a vivid picture of a town grappling with the realities of war. Tales of victory gardens, ration books, and long nights waiting for letters from the front filled the pages. Yet, as captivating as these accounts were, none mentioned William or Eleanor by name. Frustration gnawed at Natalie as she flipped through yet another binder. The details she sought felt tantalizingly close, hidden just out of reach. Her resolve wavered, and for a moment, she considered setting the binders aside. But then, in the middle of an interview transcript dated 1982, she found it. The name leaped from the page: Eleanor Whitaker. The interviewee, a woman named Clara Hensley, spoke of her memories of the Whitaker family, who had lived on the outskirts of town. Clara described Eleanor as kind-hearted and soft-spoken, a young woman who had captured the hearts of many with her quiet strength. But it was Clara's mention of a mysterious love affair that sent a chill down Natalie's spine. Clara's account was fragmented, her memory hazy after decades. She recalled whispers of Eleanor's engagement to a soldier named William Harrison and the letters he sent her from overseas. According to Clara, the relationship was marked by tragedy. William had been reported missing in action in late 1944, and Eleanor had been inconsolable. She withdrew from social life, spending her days tending the family farm and her nights alone in the old Victorian house, which had once belonged to her grandmother. Natalie's heart ached as she read Clara's words. The fragments of Eleanor's life painted a picture of a woman defined by loss, her world reduced to the walls of the house she had inherited. The letters and the locket took on new significance, not just as relics of a love story, but as symbols of a life interrupted. William's absence had left a void, and Eleanor had filled it with memories she could no longer share. As Natalie copied the details into her notebook, Margaret approached with a cautious smile. "I thought you might like to see this," she said, placing a black and white photograph on the table. The image depicted a group of soldiers standing in front of a military barracks, their faces youthful and determined. Margaret pointed to one of the men, his expression serious but his eyes warm. "That's William Harrison," she said. "This photo was donated by a local family whose grandfather served with him." Natalie stared at the photograph, her breath catching. William's features were unmistakable, the same intensity she had imagined from his letters captured in the faded image. She felt a pang of sorrow for the life he had never returned to, the love he had left behind. Yet the photograph also felt like a gift, a tangible connection to the man whose words had transcended time. Before leaving the society, Margaret handed Natalie a copy of the photograph along with a folder of additional documents she thought might be useful. "If you find anything else," she said, "please let us know. Stories like this deserve to be remembered." Natalie thanked her, feeling a renewed sense of purpose as she stepped back into the winter air. The snow had begun to fall again, a soft, persistent drizzle that clung to her coat as she made her way to her car. The photograph and the notes weighed heavily in her bag, but it was the emotional weight of the story that pressed most heavily on her. Back at the Victorian house, the evening unfolded in quiet contemplation. Natalie spread the photograph and the documents across the library desk, the flickering firelight casting shadows over the artifacts. She thought of William, standing among his comrades, and of Eleanor, waiting in vain for his return. The house seemed to echo with their unspoken words, the walls bearing witness to a love that had defied time and space. Natalie spent hours piecing together the fragments of their story, her mind racing with possibilities. The details she had uncovered raised more questions than answers. What had happened to William after he went missing? Had he survived, only to be lost to Eleanor in some other way? Or had his absence been permanent, leaving Eleanor to live with the ghost of what might have been? As the fire burned low and the snow piled high outside, Natalie felt the house settle into its familiar quiet. She resolved to keep searching, knowing that the answers were out there, waiting to be found. The echoes in the dust, buried beneath years of history, would not remain hidden forever. And as she drifted into a restless sleep, the photograph of William and the memory of Eleanor's quiet strength stayed with her, urging her onward. Chapter 5. Echoes in Ink. The snow had begun to fall heavier now, the first of the season coating the world outside in a blanket of white. It was a serene, quiet snowfall, the kind that made the world feel as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something. For Natalie, that something was the house, the restoration that she had come to care for in ways she hadn't expected. Each creak of the old wooden floors, each dusty corner she uncovered felt like a whispered secret, a piece of history waiting to be rediscovered. But it was the attic that had drawn her most, an untold mystery that seemed to beckon her every time she walked past. The attic door was old, the wood darkened by years of neglect, and it creaked loudly when she pushed it open. A thin layer of dust hung in the air, disturbed only by the occasional footstep or movement of the air. But it was the sight before her that truly captured her attention. Old trunks, stacks of yellowed newspapers, faded photographs, and fragile furniture, all covered in sheets that had turned brittle with age. As she stepped into the dim light of the attic, Natalie could feel the weight of the past pressing around her, a reminder that this house, this place, had lived countless lives before hers. She hadn't come up here with any particular purpose in mind, but the moment she set foot inside, it was as if the attic itself had been waiting for her. Slowly, Natalie began to sift through the layers of forgotten history. Each box she opened, each item she touched, seemed to carry with it a part of a story. She found letters, some tied with ribbon, others simply loose, as though someone had once been in the middle of something important. Yet it was a small, worn box that caught her eye. It wasn't particularly large, no bigger than a shoebox, and it was tucked into the farthest corner beneath a pile of old blankets. She knelt down, her fingers trembling slightly with the thrill of discovery, and slowly pulled the box free. It was heavier than she expected, and when she opened it, her heart skipped at the sight of what lay inside. Nestled beneath layers of tissue paper were a collection of love letters, fragile and yellowed with age, yet still legible. The handwriting was elegant, flowing with a fluidity that made her pause. The letters seemed intimate, personal, and filled with longing, as if they held the secrets of a love that had once been. Curiosity drove Natalie to pick up the first letter and unfold it carefully. The ink was faded but readable, and the words seemed to carry a weight far beyond the paper they were written on. My dearest Eleanor, the days grow colder, and my thoughts of you grow warmer. It seems that with each passing moment, I find myself more deeply ensnared in the enchantment of your love. I hope that the letters I send you give you comfort, as you have given me a sense of peace I did not know was possible. It is not simply your beauty that stirs me, but your spirit, the way your laughter dances in the air, and the way your kindness touches everyone around you. I long for the day when I can hold you once more. Natalie's fingers lingered on the delicate paper as she read the words. It was clear from the very first sentence that this was not just an ordinary love letter. It was filled with emotion, a depth of feeling that seemed almost tangible. She set it down gently and picked up the next letter, her eyes scanning the elegant script. My beloved, I cannot express to you the depth of my longing. There is a pull in my heart that draws me toward you, a force stronger than anything I have ever known. And yet, the distance between us feels like an ocean, too vast to cross. I hold on to the hope that, soon, we will be together, and when that moment comes, nothing will ever separate us. A shiver ran down Natalie's spine. There was something so raw and intimate in these letters, something that made her feel like an intruder, even though she had stumbled upon them by chance. The love between these two people, Eleanor and the man who had written to her, seemed as real and passionate as anything Natalie had ever known, and yet it was all wrapped in the past. The letters spoke of longing and desire, of a love that was unfulfilled, and the more she read, the more Natalie felt the weight of their story pressing down on her. She carefully set the letters back into the box and closed the lid. As much as she had been drawn to them, there was an overwhelming sense that the discovery of these letters was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning. These letters had been written long before she had come into this house, but there was something about them that felt alive, as if the emotions they contained were still present, still waiting to be understood. Natalie didn't know why, but she felt compelled to learn more. She needed to understand the story of Eleanor and her lover. She didn't have to wait long before Liam came into the picture again. As if by fate, or perhaps sheer coincidence, he was working in the local library one afternoon when she decided to visit him. The connection she had felt with him the first time they met was undeniable, and as she approached him, she realized that she needed his help. He was the historian, after all. If anyone could help her uncover the truth behind these letters, it would be him. When Liam saw her walk into the library, there was a momentary look of surprise in his eyes, but it quickly faded into something warmer. He stood up from behind the counter, his usual calm demeanor offering her a reassuring smile. Natalie, what brings you here today? I found something, she said, holding out the small box she had carried with her. I think it's important. I need your help. Liam took the box gently from her, his brow furrowing in curiosity. As he opened it, his eyes widened slightly when he saw the letters inside. These are old. Very old. I know, she replied softly. I've been reading them. I think there's a story here, Liam. A love story. maybe even a tragedy. I need to know what happened to these people. To Eleanor and the man who wrote these letters, Liam nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of the paper. This is fascinating, he murmured, almost to himself. I can help, but we'll need to do some digging. Natalie smiled faintly, her heart swelling with hope. I thought you might say that. And with that, their journey into the past deepened. The snow continued to fall outside, and as it did, something began to shift within Natalie. The house, the letters, the man who had written them. All of it seemed to be drawing her into a story much bigger than she had ever anticipated. A story that, like the Christmas season itself, seemed filled with magic and wonder, just waiting to unfold. But as much as the past beckoned, the present was never far behind. And in the days to come, Natalie would find herself facing choices that would not only uncover the truth behind the letters, but also lead her to a love that would change her life forever. Chapter 6. The Historian's Key. The days leading up to Christmas were a blur for Natalie. Between the endless work at the Victorian house, the excitement of the upcoming holiday tour, and the growing connection she felt with Liam, everything seemed to blur together. The snow outside continued to fall, transforming the town into a winter wonderland. And inside the house, the Christmas spirit had begun to take root in ways she hadn't anticipated. The scent of pine from the freshly cut tree mingled with the scent of dust and old wood, and it felt like a cozy contradiction, both new and old, familiar and strange. Yet, as much as the house had begun to feel like home, it was the letters that consumed her thoughts. Every evening after she finished working, Natalie would return to her little corner in the parlor and read through the stack of letters she had found in the attic. She had become absorbed by the story between Eleanor and the unnamed man, their love for each other that seemed both passionate and full of sorrow. The more she read, the more she felt a deep connection to them, as though their emotions and longing were reaching out to her across time. Liam had agreed to help her with the investigation, though he had warned her that it might take some time to uncover any real answers. Still, he shared her fascination with the story and eagerly joined her on visits to the local archives, hoping to find any trace of Eleanor or the man who had written such heartfelt letters. Each afternoon, they would pore over old town records, photographs, and census data, but so far, they had found little to tie the letters to the real world. It was as if Eleanor and her lover had vanished, leaving behind only a faint echo. As Natalie sat one evening, the fire crackling softly in the hearth, she thought back to the last letter she had read. It was filled with sadness, a plea for the reunion that never came. My dearest Eleanor, I have come to realize that we may never have the life we dreamed of together. The war has taken so much from us, and I fear it has taken you from me as well. I do not know how to live without you, but I will hold on to the memory of our love as tightly as I can, hoping that someday, somehow, we will find a way back to each other. Until then, know that you are always in my heart. The words haunted her, leaving her with an ache she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the loss of love that struck her, but the sense of longing and the thought of all the years that had passed without resolution. She had no way of knowing whether the couple had ever reunited, but the sadness in the letter lingered with her. She stood up, closing the letter gently, and walked over to the window. The snow outside had thickened, blanketing the world in a soft silence. The holiday lights on the houses shimmered against the darkened sky, creating a magical, almost surreal atmosphere. She had always loved Christmas, but this year, there was something different. The house, the letters, and Liam. Everything seemed to be converging in ways that felt far too significant to be coincidence. As she stared out into the snowy night, the sound of a knock on the door broke through her thoughts. She turned, startled, and quickly moved to answer it. Standing on the doorstep was Liam, his coat dusted with snow and a grin on his face. Despite the cold, He seemed to bring a warmth with him, something that drew her in. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Liam said with a small laugh, brushing the snow from his shoulders. "Of course not. Come in," Natalie said, stepping aside to let him in. Liam shook the snow from his boots and hung his coat on the nearby hook before following her into the parlor. He seemed unusually excited, his eyes bright with something she couldn't quite place. "I think I might have found something," he said, holding up a small, weathered book. "It's not much, but it might be a lead." Natalie's heart raced as she took the book from him, her fingers trembling slightly. It was an old town registry from the 1940s, a collection of names, addresses, and births, marriages, and deaths. She flipped it open, scanning the yellowed pages. Her eyes landed on a name that made her heart skip a beat: Eleanor Thompson. The name was followed by a series of dates: birth, marriage, and a death that seemed too early, too soon. "This is her," Natalie said quietly, her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "Eleanor Thompson. She was real." Liam nodded. "It seems that way. I did some cross-referencing, and she lived right here in town. I couldn't find much more, but there's a mention of her in the obituary section. She passed away in 1945, just a year after the last letter you found." Natalie felt a rush of emotions flood over her: relief, sorrow, and a deep sense of connection. Eleanor had existed. She had been a real person, and she had lived through the same winter she was now experiencing. The thought that their stories were intertwined in this way sent a shiver down her spine. "I need to know more," Natalie whispered, more to herself than to Liam. "We have to find out what happened. What happened to her lover, the man who wrote those letters? Did they ever meet again?" Liam's expression softened. "I'll help you. We'll find the answers." Over the next few days, Natalie and Liam immersed themselves in the past, sifting through old town records and talking to locals who might have remembered Eleanor. They learned that Eleanor had been a schoolteacher, beloved by the town, but very little was known about the man who had written her letters. The town's history was filled with war stories, love stories, and heartbreak, but it seemed that Eleanor's love story had been one of those that had been forgotten, swept away by the passage of time. As the days grew shorter and Christmas drew nearer, Natalie couldn't help but feel that the answers were just out of reach. But with each new piece of information, with every letter she read, the story of Eleanor and her lover grew more real to her. It felt as though she were unraveling a mystery that had been waiting decades to be solved. And in some small, inexplicable way, she felt that Eleanor's love was somehow linked to her own. The story of lost love and unfulfilled promises resonated within her, reminding her of the importance of embracing the present, of not letting time slip by without cherishing the moments that mattered. On the eve of Christmas Eve, as the town prepared for the holiday celebrations, Natalie stood in the parlor once more, her hand resting on the old chest where the letters were kept. She gazed out at the snow falling gently against the night sky, her heart full of hope for the answers yet to come, for the love that was still waiting to be discovered. The house, the letters, and the past had all brought her to this moment, and somehow, she knew that whatever she uncovered next would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Chapter 7: Shadows of a Soldier. The town had fully embraced the Christmas spirit, its streets twinkling with festive lights and the air crisp with the scent of pine and fresh snow. The restoration of the Victorian house was nearing its completion, and the anticipation surrounding the holiday tour had reached its peak. Yet, amid the festive preparations and the whirlwind of activities that came with the season, Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. The letters, Eleanor's story, and the man who had written them consumed her thoughts. Every moment she spent in the house felt like she was treading in a forgotten history, a past that was whispering to her from the shadows, urging her to uncover the truth. It was late one evening when Natalie received a call that would change everything. She had been at the house, carefully arranging antique furniture and finalizing the small details for the tour, when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. "Liam." "Hi, Liam," she answered, her voice soft but eager. "Hey, Natalie," Liam replied, his tone a mix of excitement and urgency. "I found something. It's not much, but it's a lead I think you need to hear." Her heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "I went back to the archives today. I found a letter, an actual letter from Eleanor herself, written to a friend, but it's dated months after the last one you found. It's not as emotional, but it mentions someone, a man named Thomas. I'm not sure who he is yet, but he might be the one who wrote to her." Natalie felt her breath catch in her throat. "Thomas," she repeated, tasting the name on her lips as though it were a key to unlocking the mystery she had been chasing for weeks. "I know it's not much, but it's a start. I'm heading over to the town hall tomorrow to look for any records I can find about him. I think we might be getting closer." The excitement in Liam's voice was palpable, and for the first time in days, Natalie felt a surge of hope. She knew this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of the final piece of the puzzle. "I'll meet you at the town hall tomorrow morning," Natalie said, her voice filled with determination. "We'll find him, Liam. I know we will." The next morning, the world outside was still blanketed in snow, the town looking like something straight out of a holiday card. Natalie bundled up against the cold and made her way to the town hall, her heart racing in anticipation. When she arrived, she saw Liam waiting for her by the steps, his breath visible in the cold air. He gave her a warm smile as she approached. "We've got a lot to go through," Liam said, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "But I think this might be the breakthrough we needed." Inside the town hall, the old records were kept in rows of dusty cabinets, and the scent of aged paper filled the air. Natalie and Liam began to sift through the files, searching for any mention of Thomas, the man who might have been Eleanor's true love. Hours passed, and the search seemed endless, but Natalie couldn't give up. She knew they were close. It wasn't until late in the afternoon that they found it, a marriage record, tucked away between pages of unrelated documents. The name on the record was Thomas Hargrove. The date was significant too, just months after Eleanor's death. The entry mentioned a brief ceremony in the town hall, a small affair with only a few witnesses. Liam skimmed through the page. This might be it. If he was married after Eleanor died, it could mean that she wasn't the love of his life. Or maybe there was more to their story than we knew. But why didn't he marry her? Natalie whispered, her mind racing. Why didn't they ever end up together? Liam nodded slowly, his eyes distant. Maybe there's a reason they were kept apart. Circumstances beyond their control. We'll need to dig deeper. They spent the rest of the afternoon combing through other records. The search was slow, but every small discovery felt like a revelation. Thomas Hargrove had been a soldier during the war, and his records indicated that he had been stationed overseas for much of the conflict. There was a mention of a severe injury in 1944, one that had left him unable to return home for several months. Whether this had anything to do with his inability to see Eleanor again was still unclear, but it added a layer of complexity to the story. When they finally left the town hall, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the town square. The festive lights twinkled all around them, and yet Natalie felt a growing sense of unease. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to come together, but they still didn't have all the answers. Thomas's life after the war, his connection to Eleanor. It was all shrouded in mystery. Liam walked with her in the direction of her house, the cold air biting at their faces, but neither of them seemed to mind. It was a comfortable silence between them, one that had come to define their time together over the past few weeks. As they reached the front steps of the Victorian house, Natalie turned to Liam, her heart full of thoughts and emotions that were hard to sort through. "Liam," she began, her voice soft but resolute. "I need to know more about Thomas. And I need to know about Eleanor's life after the war, whether she was waiting for him, or if something else kept them apart. Liam looked at her, his brow furrowed in thought. I understand, but there's one thing we can't forget in all this, he said, his voice gentle. The love Eleanor and Thomas shared was real, Natalie. And even though it didn't have the happy ending they dreamed of, it's still a love story worth remembering. Sometimes, the greatest love stories don't have a perfect ending. They just leave behind a mark, something that stays with you forever. Natalie smiled faintly, her heart swelling at his words. There was a part of her that had always believed in the power of love, even when it didn't fit the conventional mold of happily ever afters. Perhaps this was one of those stories, a tale that had been lost to time, but was now being resurrected in ways that she hadn't expected. You're right, she said quietly. We'll find the answers, Liam. I can feel it. As the first snowflakes of the evening began to fall once again, Natalie and Liam stood on the doorstep of the house, two people caught between the past and the present, each searching for their own answers. The magic of Christmas seemed to swirl around them, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as though the world had come to a standstill, each moment suspended in time, waiting for something to unfold. With the promise of new discoveries ahead, Natalie couldn't help but wonder what lay at the end of this journey. Would she finally uncover the full story of Eleanor and Thomas? And more importantly, what would she discover about her own heart in the process? As the door closed behind them, a sense of quiet anticipation filled the air, like the first stirring of a Christmas miracle. Chapter 8. A Dance in the Snow. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the heavy snow clouds, casting the Victorian house in a muted glow. Natalie stood in the parlor, the photograph of Eleanor held delicately in her hands. It was as though the young woman's gaze reached across the decades, imploring Natalie to uncover the truth. Every detail of the image, from the soft curl of Eleanor's hair to the faint shadow of a window pane in the background, seemed steeped in significance. Yet, for all its beauty, the photograph felt like an unfinished sentence, waiting for its conclusion. Natalie spent the early hours cataloging her discoveries so far, arranging them on the desk like a detective sorting evidence. The locket, the letters, William's journal, and now the photograph each seemed to hold a piece of the story, but the connections between them remained elusive. The discovery of Eleanor's image in the photo album had sparked new questions. How had the photograph returned to the house? And what had become of William after his fateful journey to France? With these questions gnawing at her, Natalie decided to shift her focus back to the house itself. If the photograph had been hidden here, perhaps there were other artifacts waiting to be uncovered. The attic, with its towering stacks of forgotten belongings, seemed the most likely place to continue her search. Armed with a flashlight and a notebook, she ascended the narrow staircase, each creak of the steps echoing in the stillness. The attic was a treasure trove of history, its air thick with the scent of aged wood and mothballs. Dust motes danced in the beams of light streaming through the small circular window. Natalie scanned the space, her eyes falling on an old steamer trunk tucked beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers. The trunk was weathered but intact, its brass fittings dulled with age. She knelt before it, her fingers brushing over the initials etched into the lid. EW. Her pulse quickened as she lifted the lid. Inside, the trunk was filled with carefully folded linens, a delicate lace shawl, and a collection of books. Beneath these, she found a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was instantly recognizable. Eleanor's elegant script. Natalie's hands trembled as she untied the ribbon, revealing letters dated after the war's end. The first letter, written in early 1946, was addressed to a name Natalie didn't recognize, Claire DuPont. As she read, the pieces of the puzzle began to shift once more. Eleanor's words spoke of gratitude and heartache, thanking Claire for her kindness and support during a difficult time. "Your letter about William brought me both solace and sorrow," Eleanor had written. "To know he was alive, even for a short while, is a blessing I will always cherish. But the pain of his absence remains a wound that time cannot heal." The letter mentioned a package containing a few of William's belongings, sent by Claire from Saint Etienne. Natalie's breath caught as she realized the connection. Claire Dupont must have been one of the villagers who had cared for William in France. The trunk's contents suddenly felt charged with new meaning, as though it held the echoes of Eleanor and William's entwined lives. She set the letters aside and continued exploring the trunk. Beneath a layer of faded photographs and postcards, she found a small wooden box. The lid slid open easily, revealing a collection of trinkets: a silver pocket watch, a worn leather journal, and a small vial containing a few grains of sand. Natalie opened the journal with care, her heart racing as she saw William's handwriting once more. These entries were different from those in the larger journal she had already found, their tone more introspective and raw. "The days blur together here," he had written in one entry. "The village is quiet, the people kind, but my thoughts are heavy with all I've left behind. I see Eleanor's face in my dreams, and I wonder if she'll ever know the truth. It feels as though I'm caught between worlds, unable to return to the life I knew yet unable to move forward." As Natalie read, the weight of William's isolation became palpable. The journal offered glimpses of his time in Saint Etienne, describing the simple rhythms of life there and his efforts to heal from both physical and emotional wounds. But there were no definitive answers about why he hadn't returned to Eleanor. The entries tapered off abruptly, leaving Natalie with more questions than ever. Determined to learn more about Claire Dupont, Natalie decided to contact a colleague with connections to French historical societies. She spent the afternoon drafting an email, outlining the details she had uncovered and requesting any information about Claire or Saint Etienne during the post-war years. The act of writing felt like sending a message into the void, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between past and present. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Natalie returned to the library, her mind a whirlwind of possibilities. She placed the newly discovered letters and journal alongside the other artifacts, the collection growing into a tapestry of lives long past. Each item felt like a thread in an intricate web, drawing her closer to the heart of the story. That night, as snowflakes drifted silently past the windows, Natalie found herself unable to sleep. She sat by the fire, the letters spread before her, and read them again and again. Eleanor's words painted a vivid picture of her love and longing, her resilience in the face of unanswered questions. The connection between the two women felt almost tangible, as though Eleanor's voice was guiding Natalie toward the truth. In the quiet hours before dawn, a thought struck Natalie with sudden clarity. The sand in the vial she had found. Could it be from the beaches of Normandy? If so, it was another link to William's time in France, another clue waiting to be deciphered. She resolved to have it analyzed, hoping it might reveal something definitive about William's journey. The shadows of yesterday loomed large, their presence both haunting and inspiring. Natalie knew the answers she sought were close, hidden in the fragments of William and Eleanor's story. And as the first light of morning crept across the snow, she felt a renewed determination to bring their voices out of the past and into the light. Chapter 9. The Ghost of December Past. The winter air had become colder, biting through Natalie's coat as she stood on the porch of the Victorian house. The snow had turned to a fine dusting, soft and quiet, settling on the edges of the steps and clinging to the skeletal branches of the nearby trees. It was the sort of evening that seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something that might come or might never. It had been nearly a week since she and Liam had uncovered the first letter, and with each passing day, the mystery deepened. They had spent hours together, combing through the letters in between the restoration work that had taken over the house. With each piece of correspondence, the connection between the two lovers from the past became more vivid. The words in the letters were tender, filled with longing and affection, but there were also signs of hardship, mentions of distance, of waiting, of promises made and broken. The last letter they had found had left a heavy weight in the air between them. It spoke of a decision that was never made clear, a finality that neither Liam nor Natalie could quite understand. Tonight, however, she had something different on her mind. The evening's quiet had prompted her thoughts to turn inward, her mind swirling with questions that had little to do with the house or the letters. The closer she got to unraveling the story of the past, the more she found herself thinking about Liam. Their time spent together had shifted in a way that felt unspoken, almost invisible, but undeniable. The comfort they found in each other's company, the way they seemed to effortlessly understand one another's silences, it was becoming more than just shared work. It was becoming something else, something she wasn't sure how to define, but couldn't ignore. The soft sound of footsteps broke through her reverie, and she turned to find Liam approaching from the driveway. He was bundled up in his thick woolen coat, his hands tucked into his pockets, the dim light from the porch casting long shadows over his face. He looked as if he had been outside for some time, the edges of his scarf fluttering gently in the wind. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a quiet recognition between them, as if they both understood the delicate shift in their relationship. "I thought I might find you out here," Liam said, his voice low and steady, but with an edge of something she couldn't place. Natalie gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I needed some air. The house has been so full of noise today. Sometimes it's good to get away from it," Liam replied, stepping closer and standing beside her at the railing. "Is everything all right?" She nodded, though her thoughts felt far from settled. The restoration had been moving along at a steady pace, but the closer they came to revealing the full extent of the letters, the more unsettled she felt. It was as though the walls of the house were closing in around her, and she was being pulled into a world that felt both distant and too immediate. "I've been thinking about the letters," she admitted, her gaze fixed on the faint outlines of the trees against the snowy landscape. "There's something strange about them. It's like they're trying to tell us something, but we're only catching glimpses." Liam was silent for a long moment, his breath visible in the crisp air. He, too, seemed to be lost in thought, his eyes distant as he looked out toward the horizon. "They feel like pieces of a puzzle, don't they? Each one a little more of the story, but never the whole picture." Natalie's pulse quickened at his words. She hadn't realized it before, but that was exactly how she had been feeling. Like they were uncovering parts of a story that would never quite make sense, but which somehow still mattered. "What do you think it all means?" she asked softly, turning to face him. Liam's gaze shifted to meet hers, his expression unreadable for a moment. "I think it's a story that's meant to be uncovered, bit by bit. And maybe it's not just about what happened back then, but what happens now." Her breath caught in her throat. The way he said it, like it was something they were both a part of, struck her with an unexpected intensity. She could feel the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them, the quiet tension building, but she didn't know how to break it. Before she could respond, Liam stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he muttered, almost to himself. "I think I'm just looking for answers. For both of us." The wind had picked up, swirling the snowflakes around them in a dizzying dance. Natalie hugged her arms to herself, her thoughts spinning as the warmth of the house seemed a long way off. They had come so far together, yet there were so many things left unsaid. She had never been one to shy away from hard truths, but something about Liam, his quiet intensity, the way he seemed to carry the weight of the world without asking for help, made her hesitant. "I think we both are," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Looking for answers. I don't know if we'll ever find them, but maybe it's the searching that matters." Liam nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers once more, though this time there was something in them, something deep, something unspoken, that made her heart race. He didn't say anything more, but the way he looked at her in that moment, as though she were a piece of the puzzle he was trying to solve, left her with a sense of unease she couldn't quite explain. The air between them was thick with something, an unacknowledged connection that neither of them was ready to confront. As the snow fell around them, their breaths rising in the cold night air, Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift. She didn't know what it was, but she could feel it in her bones. With a quiet sigh, Liam turned to walk back toward the house, his footsteps crunching in the snow. Natalie watched him go, her thoughts still tangled in the mystery of the past, and in the presence of the man who had unwittingly become a part of it. She wasn't sure what the future held, but as the door closed softly behind her, she couldn't help but wonder. Was it the past that was shaping their present, or was it the present that was rewriting the past? And as she stepped back into the warmth of the house, she realized one thing with certainty. She wasn't the only one searching for answers. Chapter 10. Fragments of Forever. The snow continued to fall in gentle flurries, covering the town in a blanket of white. Each morning, the world seemed to wake up anew beneath its soft, silencing coat. For Natalie, this winter had taken on a different meaning, one she hadn't anticipated when she first arrived in town. The house, which had initially been a mere project, was becoming a place of unexpected revelations, both about history and herself. But it was Liam who had come to occupy a space in her thoughts, a space she hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to navigate. It had been nearly 2 weeks since that evening on the porch, and things between them hadn't been the same. The air between them, once filled with the easy rhythm of shared work, now felt taut, as though they were standing on the precipice of something neither of them dared to acknowledge. They still worked side by side, their focus on the house and the letters, but there was a distance now, a quiet awareness that hovered between them, always present but never spoken aloud. That morning, Natalie had woken with a strange sense of urgency. The house was nearly ready for its holiday tour. Only a few final touches remained, but something about the letters continued to tug at her. They had uncovered more pieces of the past, but the story still felt incomplete. And with the tour approaching, it was as though time itself was pushing her forward, urging her to unravel whatever secrets lay buried within the walls. She stood in the entryway, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns of the wallpaper that had been painstakingly restored. The faded floral designs seemed to hold a certain magic, evidence of lives lived long before her, of moments frozen in time. The house had a way of drawing her in, as though it were inviting her to become part of its story, to fill in the gaps that the past had left behind. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the creaky floorboards, and she turned to find Liam standing in the doorway of the adjacent room. His gaze was steady, his posture relaxed, but there was an unreadable quality in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. It had been days since they had spoken much outside of the work at hand, and there was a tension between them that Natalie couldn't shake. "Morning," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Good morning," she replied, her voice betraying the knot that had formed in her chest. "How's the progress in the kitchen?" "Almost done," Liam answered, his lips curling slightly at the edges, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just need to finish up the molding and some of the final touches. Then it's all set." "That's great," she said, her smile lacking the usual warmth. "I'm hoping we can get everything wrapped up soon. I feel like there's still so much to do." Liam nodded, his gaze drifting to the stack of letters that lay on the table beside her. The small box of handwritten pages had become a constant presence between them, their contents never far from their minds. It was as though the more they uncovered, the more they both wanted to push aside the lingering discomfort of the unknown. But neither of them had come up with any answers, and the silence that followed each new letter only deepened the mystery. "Have you thought about where to go next with the letters?" Liam asked, his voice low, as though he were treading carefully. Natalie hesitated before answering, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I don't know," she admitted. "I feel like we're missing something important, but I'm not sure what it is. We've only uncovered pieces of their story, but there's so much more. I keep wondering if we're looking in the wrong places." Liam stepped closer, his eyes searching hers, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to hum with unspoken understanding. "Maybe we're not supposed to find all the answers," he said, his voice softer now, almost as if the words were meant only for her. "Maybe it's not about the letters. Maybe it's about what happens next." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Natalie felt her heart skip a beat. She couldn't quite place the look in his eyes, something that seemed to carry both an invitation and a warning, a possibility and a risk. Her thoughts were racing, her pulse quickening, but she pushed the thoughts aside. They were here to uncover the past, not to dwell on feelings that had no place in the middle of a restoration project. "Maybe," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, "but I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something crucial." Liam didn't reply right away. Instead, he turned his gaze to the stack of letters once more. His fingers brushed over the edges of the papers as if contemplating something deeper. When he spoke again, his voice was tinged with uncertainty. "There's something about the last letter we found. It feels different from the others. Almost like it was meant to be the end of the story, but the beginning of something else." Natalie's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't told him how she had felt the same way. Like that letter held the key to everything, but also a sense of closure that made it difficult to move forward. She had been avoiding the finality of it, hoping that more letters would surface to continue the story, to give her the answers she so desperately sought. But in the back of her mind, she wondered if perhaps they had already reached the end of the road. "I've been thinking about that too," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I can't bring myself to look at it again." Liam's expression softened, and he nodded as though understanding something unspoken. "I get it. It's hard to let go of something once you've started unraveling it. But sometimes the ending is what gives everything else meaning." The silence between them stretched, both of them standing in the doorway, the weight of their words hanging in the space between them. It was as though they were standing on the edge of something that had the potential to change everything, but neither of them was willing to take the first step. Finally, Natalie spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe it's time we stopped looking for answers in the past and started making some of our own." Liam's eyes met hers again, and for the first time in days, there was a flicker of something warmer in his gaze. "Maybe," he said softly, his voice carrying a trace of something hopeful. As they stood there, the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in a layer of soft, unspoken possibility. The house around them seemed to breathe with the weight of its history, and the letters, those quiet whispers of the past, waited for them to decide what to do next. And yet, beneath the frost, something else was stirring, something between them, something neither of them had anticipated, but both of them had unknowingly been waiting for. Chapter 11. The Language of Letters. The air was heavier that morning, thick with anticipation, as if the house itself could feel the weight of the days slipping by. Natalie stood in the center of the living room, her gaze drifting across the freshly restored space. The fireplace, now complete with its polished stone, flickered in the warmth from the crackling fire. The walls, with their soft cream and golden accents, reflected the gentle light. The house was taking shape, each room revealing more of its former grandeur, as though it were waking up from a long, quiet slumber. But despite the beauty of the restoration, there was something unsettling about the stillness in the house. The air felt taut, laden with something unspoken, something unresolved. The work had slowed over the past few days, not because of lack of effort, but because something had changed between her and Liam. The letters, too, seemed to have lost their clarity. Each one had held its own piece of the story, but together, they had formed more questions than answers. Natalie's thoughts were broken by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to find Liam standing in the doorway, his hands tucked into his pockets, his eyes distant. He had been quieter than usual, his movements more deliberate, as though he were carefully navigating the space between them. "You've made a lot of progress," he said, his voice calm. But there was an edge to it, a tension she hadn't quite understood. "It looks beautiful in here." "Thanks," Natalie replied, her gaze moving toward the large window framed with lace curtains that hung softly, catching the light. "It's strange, isn't it? How something so old can feel so new again." Liam nodded, though his expression didn't shift. "It's like it's always been here, waiting to be brought back to life." She paused, the words hanging between them like the still air in the room. The house, restored to its former beauty, felt like a space suspended in time. A space where everything had been carefully preserved, but where things still seemed frozen. And maybe it was the same for them. They had spent so much time in the quiet rhythm of their work that they had neglected to consider what would happen once the work was done. "What's wrong?" she finally asked, her voice hesitant. She had known him long enough to sense the change in him, to feel the distance between them grow, though it had never been mentioned aloud. It was as though they had both been dancing around the truth for weeks, never quite finding the courage to step into it. Liam looked away, his gaze drifting toward the flickering fire. "Nothing's wrong," he said, though his tone didn't match his words. "It's just, I've been thinking a lot lately." "About what?" Natalie asked, her heart quickening in her chest. She had never seen him like this, withdrawn, distant, as though he were holding something back. He had always been open, even in his quietness. But now, something was different. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice almost to himself. "About the house, about the letters, about us." Natalie's breath caught, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stop. She had known this conversation was coming, but knowing it didn't make it any easier to face. The house, the letters, everything had led to this moment, this point where they would have to decide what to do with the connection they had slowly been building over the past weeks. "I don't want things to change," Liam continued, his voice more steady now, though it carried a weight that settled in the pit of her stomach. "But they already have, haven't they?" Natalie swallowed, the knot in her chest tightening. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't sure, that she didn't know what was happening, that she was just as lost in this as he was. But the words wouldn't come, and instead, she found herself nodding, as though acknowledging a truth that had always been there, lurking just beneath the surface. "I think I've been trying to ignore it," she admitted softly. "I've been so focused on the house, on the letters, that I haven't really looked at what's happening between us. And now I don't know where we're supposed to go from here." Liam's gaze softened, though his expression remained unreadable. He took a step closer, but there was still a distance between them, an invisible boundary that neither of them seemed willing to cross. "I don't think we need to have all the answers right now," he said quietly. "I just think we need to figure out if we're on the same path." The words echoed in the silence of the room, and Natalie found herself standing on the precipice of something unknown, something that felt both frightening and inevitable. She had never been good at waiting, at letting things unfold without control. But now, with the house standing silently around them and the weight of the past pressing on her shoulders, she wondered if she had any choice but to let it unfold on its own. "We've both been chasing something," she said, almost to herself. "The house, the letters, the past. But maybe it's time we stop chasing things we can't change and start focusing on what's right in front of us." Liam's eyes met hers, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled in the background, its warmth contrasting with the coolness in the air. The walls of the house seemed to listen, their secrets tucked away in the shadows, their memories stitched into the fabric of the space. Finally, Liam took a breath, his shoulders relaxing as if a weight had been lifted, or perhaps simply acknowledged. "Maybe," he said softly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe it's time to stop looking backward." For the first time in what felt like forever, the silence between them wasn't heavy with uncertainty. Instead, there was a shift, a subtle change that filled the room with a new kind of understanding. An understanding that the answers they were looking for wouldn't come from the past. They would come from the choices they made now, in the present. Natalie nodded, her heart lighter than it had been in days. She had no idea what the future held, or where the path they were now walking would take them, but for the first time, she felt as though they were moving forward together, not apart. And in that moment, as the light from the fire danced across the room, she realized that some things, some connections, didn't need to be explained. They simply needed to be allowed to grow, to unfold in their own time. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a fresh layer of quiet. And in the heart of the house, where time seemed to stand still, two people stood on the cusp of something new. Something that had always been there, waiting for them to find it. Chapter 12. A Spark Rekindled. The days had blurred into a seamless ribbon of soft light and muted shadows. The house was nearly complete. Every room had been transformed, every inch of its history restored. The Christmas tour was only a few days away, and Natalie felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. But despite the beauty that surrounded her, there was an undercurrent of unease that had settled into her chest. It was not the house that troubled her, nor the progress they had made. It was the uncertainty that still lingered between her and Liam, an unspoken tension that neither of them seemed to address. The restoration had reached its peak, but the letters, the puzzle they had begun to piece together, were still far from finished. There were more to read, more to understand, but something in her gut told her that this was no longer just about history. It was about something else, and the weight of it all sat heavily on her shoulders. That afternoon, the house seemed quieter than usual. The soft echo of her footsteps on the wooden floor was the only sound that broke the silence. Natalie had spent most of the morning putting the finishing touches on the decorations, and now, she stood in the grand parlor, admiring the view from the large bay window. Snow had begun to fall again, the white flakes drifting gently to the ground, blanketing everything in a layer of pristine calm. It was beautiful, almost surreal, yet beneath the peaceful exterior, there was an unmistakable stirring in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The flickering light of the tree illuminated the room, casting long, soft shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. She took a deep breath and turned to face the table where the box of letters lay. They were scattered out now, their delicate edges curling slightly from age. Each one was a thread of the past, a whisper of something long gone, and yet, there was still so much she didn't understand. Liam had been distant the past few days, and while they had exchanged pleasantries, it felt as though they were both avoiding the things that mattered most. The closer the tour came, the further away he seemed to drift. She hadn't told him yet, but she had been wondering if the project, the house, had brought them together only because they had both been running from something else. The truth, the unspoken feelings that had bubbled up between them, were threatening to rise to the surface, and neither of them seemed ready to face it. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to see Liam standing in the doorway, his expression neutral. He had his work jacket on, his hands stuffed into his pockets as he stood there, waiting for her to acknowledge him. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Can we talk?" Natalie's heart fluttered in her chest, a strange mix of relief and anxiety bubbling up inside her. She nodded, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Liam walked in slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight as he pulled out the chair and sat across from her. His gaze immediately fell on the box of letters. It was clear that the letters had become a focal point of their time together, of everything they had done, everything they had uncovered. But Natalie could feel the distance still between them, like a thin veil that neither of them wanted to disturb. "I've been thinking about the letters," Liam said after a pause. His voice was low, as though the very subject of them carried weight. "I know we've been focused on getting this place ready, but I can't help but feel like we've missed something." Natalie tilted her head, meeting his gaze. "What do you mean?" "Something's not right with the last letter," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he spoke. "We've read everything up to that point, but it's like that one. That one doesn't belong." Natalie's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she wondered if he had been feeling the same unease that had been nagging at her. "What do you think it means?" Liam shifted in his chair, his fingers tracing the edge of the table. "I don't know, but it's different. The tone is more final, almost like a goodbye. But at the same time, it feels like it's meant to be a new beginning." She frowned, her mind racing. The letter in question had been the one they had both avoided for days now. It was the last one in the box, tucked beneath the others as though it had been waiting for them to take notice. They had been reluctant to open it, unwilling to face whatever it was that it might reveal. The other letters, though poignant, had been filled with longing and devotion, each one a beautiful piece of a love story unfolding across the years. But this final letter had felt like an end, an abrupt conclusion to a story that had barely begun. "I've been thinking about that too," Natalie confessed. "There's something strange about it, but I don't know if I'm ready to look at it again." Liam looked at her, his expression softening, though there was still an intensity in his gaze. "Maybe it's not about being ready," he said quietly. "Maybe it's about understanding that some things need to be finished. And maybe, if we finish it, we'll understand the whole story." Her breath caught, and she looked away, her gaze falling to the fire crackling in the hearth. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with implication. She had always been someone who looked ahead, who focused on the next step, the next project. But in this moment, she realized that she had been running from the past, running from whatever that last letter might reveal, not just about the lovers in the story, but about herself, about them. "I'm not sure I can face it," she admitted, her voice small, almost fragile. "What if it changes everything?" Liam leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "Maybe it's supposed to change things. Maybe that's the only way we'll know what comes next." The quietness between them stretched, thick and almost tangible. They had been here before, on the edge of something unspoken, but this time, the silence felt different. There was a finality to it, a sense that something was coming to a head. "You're right," Natalie finally said, her voice trembling just slightly. "Maybe we do need to finish it." Liam gave a small, understanding nod, and without another word, he reached for the box of letters. Slowly, he opened it, his fingers brushing over the fragile paper. He pulled out the final letter, its edges delicate, yellowed with age. He hesitated for a moment, as if sensing the gravity of what they were about to do, and then handed it to her. With trembling hands, Natalie took the letter. The weight of it seemed heavier than she had imagined. She could feel her pulse racing, the anticipation of what they might find building in her chest. The fire crackled softly in the background, the only sound in the room. "Let's see what it says," Liam whispered. Natalie took a deep breath, her fingers unsealing the envelope, and as she unfolded the paper, the world outside seemed to fade away. Chapter 13. Windows to Another Life. The words on the page blurred in front of Natalie's eyes. Her heart thudded heavily in her chest as she slowly traced the edges of the delicate paper with her fingertips. The final letter, the one they had been avoiding, felt like a relic from another time. A whisper from the past that had been waiting to be uncovered. It was dated nearly 75 years ago, yet the ink, though faded, still held the weight of a love story that had survived through the years. Liam sat across from her, his eyes fixed on the letter, watching her every movement as though waiting for her to make sense of the words. But the truth was, she wasn't sure she was ready to understand. The weight of the moment hung heavily between them, each second stretching longer than the last. There was an almost suffocating silence in the room as Natalie finally took a deep breath and began to read. The letter was written in a delicate, flowing hand, the cursive so familiar yet foreign at the same time. It spoke of love, of longing, but unlike the others, there was a sense of finality to this one. As Natalie's eyes moved across the page, she felt her breath catch in her throat. "My dearest, I write to you not with joy, but with a heavy heart. The days are long, and I fear they will be longer still without you. You've left a mark on me, one I know cannot be erased, and yet I am afraid I will not see you again. I write these words, knowing they are the last I will ever say to you. There is a coldness that fills me, a knowledge that time is not on our side. Do not wait for me. There is no future in what we've shared, though it has been the most beautiful part of my life. The distance between us, the years, the separation, it has all become too much for me to bear. I can only hope that one day, someone will love you as I have loved you, and you will know happiness. Goodbye, my love. Please, forget me. I hope you find peace. Yours, forever, J." Natalie's hands trembled as she folded the letter carefully back into its envelope. Her eyes were unfocused as she stared at the yellowed paper, the words now echoing in her mind like a distant song. The rawness of the farewell, the finality of it, struck her like a blow to the chest. There was so much pain in those words, so much love lost, and the weight of it all felt unbearable. Liam shifted in his seat, his gaze still on her, but his face unreadable. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. They both sat there, in the quiet of the room, letting the silence stretch between them. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to make sense of what they had just uncovered. "I don't understand," Natalie said quietly, breaking the stillness. Her voice was shaky, and she could feel the lump in her throat. Why would they end like this? Why would he say goodbye like that? Liam's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I don't know. It doesn't make sense. We've read all the other letters. The love between them, it was real. It was passionate. But this one feels like something changed. Like something happened that made it impossible for them to stay together." Natalie looked down at the letter again, her fingers tracing the edges of the paper. She could almost feel the weight of the words, the sorrow that had dripped from the pen onto the page. There was no mention of the circumstances, no explanation for why the relationship had come to an end, just the cold finality of goodbye. The realization hit her with a sharp clarity. This letter wasn't just the end of a relationship, it was the end of a dream. A dream of something that could have been, that might have been, but never would be. But why does he tell her to forget him? Natalie murmured to herself. Why would someone ask that of the person they love? Liam's voice broke through her thoughts. Maybe it wasn't about them, not really. Maybe it was about what was best for her. Maybe he was trying to set her free from the weight of a love that could never be fulfilled. The words hung in the air, each one feeling heavier than the last. Natalie swallowed, struggling to make sense of the emotions that were flooding her. She had always believed in the power of love, in its ability to transcend time and distance. But this letter shattered that belief. This wasn't a love that had endured. It was a love that had broken under the weight of something neither of them could control. It was a love that had been torn apart by circumstances beyond their reach. "I don't know what to do with this," she said softly, almost to herself. "It feels like we've uncovered something we shouldn't have." Liam was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "Maybe the point isn't what we're supposed to do with it," he said. "Maybe it's about understanding that some things are meant to be left in the past. We've spent so much time trying to piece together a story that may never have had the happy ending we hoped for." The finality of his words settled over her like a thick fog. He was right, in a way. They had been chasing after a story that wasn't theirs to finish, trying to resurrect a past that had long since faded. But even knowing this, Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something hidden beneath the surface, something they had yet to understand. "I can't help but feel like we're missing something," Natalie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like there's something else here, something we haven't found." Liam's eyes softened as he met her gaze. "Maybe we're not meant to find all the answers. Maybe we're just supposed to understand that some things, some people, are meant to be left behind." The weight of his words hit her like a wave. There was a bittersweet truth in what he was saying. They had spent so much time searching for answers, for meaning in the past, that they had lost sight of what was right in front of them. She had been so caught up in the history of this house, in the love story that had unfolded in the letters, that she had neglected to look at the love story unfolding between her and Liam. The room was silent again, the crackling fire filling the void. But this time, the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like an unspoken understanding between them. They had come this far together, and maybe that was enough. Maybe the letters, the house, the history, it was all just a backdrop to the present, to the connection that had grown between them without either of them realizing it. "Maybe you're right," Natalie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe some things are meant to stay in the past." Liam nodded, his expression calm but full of meaning. "We can't change what happened back then, but we can choose what we do now." As the fire flickered in the hearth and the snow continued to fall outside, Natalie felt a shift within herself, a quiet release of the weight she had been carrying. The past was still there, still waiting to be remembered, but it no longer held the power to dictate her future. The house, the letters, the stories they had uncovered, these were the remnants of something that had already been, and now, it was time to focus on what was yet to come. For the first time in days, Natalie felt at peace, as though the path ahead was clearer. She didn't have all the answers, and maybe she never would. But she knew one thing for certain. The future was hers to shape, and Liam's as well. And with that understanding, the weight of the past no longer seemed so heavy. It was simply a memory, faded, fragile, but ultimately, a part of a larger story that was still unfolding. Chapter 14. A Ribbon Between Eras. The Christmas tour was finally upon them, and the house stood proud, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight and adorned with the ornaments that Natalie had painstakingly chosen. The grand parlor, the place that had once felt so empty, now radiated warmth. The air smelled of fresh pine, the mingling scent of spices from mulled wine, and the faint aroma of old wood that had been lovingly restored. It was everything she had hoped for and more. Yet, despite the success of the day, Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something left undone, something that lingered in the corners of the house, just out of reach. Liam had been quiet since they uncovered the last letter. They had worked together to finish the final touches on the house, but the unspoken tension between them was palpable. He had withdrawn into himself, as though the letter had opened up a part of him that neither of them was ready to face. Natalie had done her best to ignore it, to focus on the joy of the tour, but it was becoming harder to pretend that everything was as it should be. She stood in the doorway of the parlor, watching the guests mingle, their voices a soft murmur that echoed off the high ceilings. The house was filled with laughter, but the noise seemed distant, as though it were all happening in another world. The decorations were perfect, the house was warm and inviting, and everything had come together as planned. And yet, she felt like a stranger in her own home. It was as though the house had become too much for her, its history, its weight, pressing down on her shoulders. Her gaze drifted to the fire crackling in the hearth, its flames dancing in the dark. She had hoped that tonight, amidst the glow of the season, she would find clarity. But as the evening wore on, she realized that it was not the house that needed to be fixed, not the tour or the decorations or the letters. It was something within herself, a longing that had been growing ever since she first set foot in this place. It was Liam. The silence between them had become unbearable, and despite her best efforts to focus on the guests and the event at hand, she couldn't help but feel the absence of something more. She couldn't deny the way her heart skipped whenever he was near, nor could she ignore the way her mind constantly wandered back to the moments they had shared, both in the house and out of it. The letters had shown her a love that had endured time and distance, and for the first time, she realized that she wanted a love like that, something real, something that could withstand the weight of the world. But Liam had been distant. He had buried himself in his work, his focus on the house and the project, as though they were both avoiding the one thing that had been growing between them. The unspoken tension, the growing attraction that neither of them seemed ready to face. As the last guests began to file out of the house, leaving behind a trail of fading laughter and the echo of footsteps on the wooden floors, Natalie found herself standing by the front door, staring out at the snow-covered yard. The night was quiet now, the only sound the soft crunch of snow beneath her boots as she stepped outside. The cold air bit at her skin, but it was a welcome distraction from the swirling thoughts in her mind. She needed to speak with Liam. She couldn't let the silence between them stretch on any longer. There were things that had to be said, things that had been left unsaid for too long. Turning back toward the house, she saw him standing by the window in the parlor, his hands tucked into his pockets as he gazed out at the winter night. There was a stillness about him, a quietness that made her heart ache. She had always admired his strength, his ability to focus on the task at hand, but in that moment, she saw the distance in his eyes, the same distance she had seen growing between them over the past few days. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward him. Her steps were tentative, but there was a resolve in her that she couldn't ignore. She had to know what was happening, what was between them, before it slipped away entirely. Liam didn't turn when he heard her approach, but she could feel the change in the air, the way his body seemed to tense at her presence. She stopped a few feet behind him, uncertain of how to begin. The words seemed to stick in her throat, trapped by the weight of everything she felt. But she knew she had to speak. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn to face her. His gaze remained fixed on the falling snow. "I know," he said softly. "I'm sorry." Her heart skipped at his words, a flutter of hope mixed with confusion. "Sorry for what?" He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. "For being distant. For not being there when you needed me." Natalie felt a pang of something. Disappointment, maybe, or something deeper, and she took a step closer to him. "I don't need you to apologize, Liam. I need to understand what's going on between us, because I can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not." Liam finally turned to face her, his eyes clouded with a mixture of regret and something more, something that made her pulse quicken. "I've been trying to figure it out myself," he admitted. But it's not easy. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. I know, but we can't keep avoiding it. Whatever this is, whatever's between us, it's not going to go away just because we ignore it. Liam's eyes softened as he looked at her, a flicker of something vulnerable passing through them. I didn't mean to pull away from you. It's just, I've never been good at this, at letting myself get close to someone, especially when I don't know where it's going. Natalie took another step forward, the distance between them narrowing. The soft crunch of snow beneath her feet seemed to echo in the stillness of the night. Neither have I, she confessed. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel it, Liam. I can't keep pretending I'm not drawn to you. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The cold air wrapped around them, the snow falling softly in the distance. But in that silence, Natalie could feel the weight of everything they had said, and everything they had yet to say. Finally, Liam took a step toward her, his hand reaching out as if uncertain of whether she would let him. I don't want to lose this, he said quietly. I don't want to lose us. Natalie's breath caught in her throat, and she reached out to take his hand. There was something in that simple gesture, something so raw and genuine, that it felt like a promise that despite the past, despite the uncertainty, they could still build something together. They could still move forward. And as she stood there, in the quiet of the snow-covered night, Natalie realized that this was what she had been waiting for all along. Not the house, not the letters, but the moment when they finally stopped running from what had been growing between them. The moment when they stopped pretending that they weren't already intertwined in a story that was just beginning. Neither do I, she whispered, her heart finally steady. And with that, the distance between them closed entirely. Chapter 15. The final envelope. The snow continued to fall outside, painting the world in a blanket of white. The world beyond the house had grown quieter, as if the winter itself had hushed the noise of the world. But within the walls of the Victorian home, a new energy had emerged, one that Natalie had been too afraid to acknowledge until now. The house, with all its history, had become a place of possibility, not just for the love stories of the past, but for her own. The days after the Christmas tour passed in a blur. The guests had marveled at the house, with its carefully restored features, the antique touches, and the subtle blend of modern warmth. But what had once been a project, an obligation that had tied Natalie to this place, had slowly transformed into something far more personal. The house was no longer just a museum of the past. It was a foundation for something new, something she and Liam could build together. As the holiday season wound down, the house seemed to breathe more easily, no longer weighed down by the pressure of the tour or the expectations of others. The rooms had begun to settle into their purpose, and so had she. Her once overwhelming feelings of uncertainty had been replaced by a quiet sense of belonging. Liam, too, seemed lighter. After their conversation that night on the front porch, a shift had occurred between them. He had stopped hiding behind his work, and though he wasn't yet the most vocal or open person, there was an honesty in his actions now. He was there for her in a way he hadn't been before, offering his support not just as a carpenter but as a partner in this strange new journey they were both on. It was early in the morning when Natalie woke to the sound of something light tapping against the window. She sat up slowly, the warmth of the blankets still clinging to her, and glanced toward the glass. Snowflakes danced outside, their delicate forms illuminated by the soft morning light. The sight was breathtaking, as it always was this time of year. But today, it felt different. Today, the world outside seemed to reflect the shift within her. The house, the letters, the history, they were all part of a greater tapestry, one that she was finally beginning to understand. Her gaze wandered to the empty chair beside her bed, where Liam had sat the night before. He had stayed with her longer these past few days, and each time, It felt like they were unraveling more of the threads that had once held them apart. She wasn't sure where it was all leading, but for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the need to rush. She stood and walked over to the window, her fingers brushing the cool glass. The quiet of the morning enveloped her, and she took a deep breath, savoring the moment. It was as though the world had slowed down for just a second, giving her the space to think, to breathe. Liam was still asleep in the next room, his presence a comforting reassurance that whatever uncertainties still lingered between them, they were in this together. She could feel it now, the weight of his care for her, the unspoken bond they had built over the past few months. It was not a fairy tale romance, nor was it something that could be neatly packaged and tied with a bow. But it was real. It was theirs. She smiled to herself, knowing that in this moment, she had everything she needed. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic declarations. What they had was steady, grounded in something deeper than surface-level attraction. It was a slow burn, one that had been kindled over time, fanned by their shared experiences, and now it was growing into something solid, something undeniable. Natalie stepped away from the window and moved quietly to the kitchen. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft light across the countertops. She made her way to the kettle, her mind still racing with thoughts of what came next. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for sure. She wanted to build a life here, not just in the house, but in this town, with Liam by her side. The sound of footsteps behind her broke her thoughts, and she turned to find Liam standing in the doorway, his shirt rumpled from sleep, his hair tousled in that way she had come to find endearing. "Morning," he said, his voice low and still heavy with sleep. "Morning," she replied, her heart warming at the sight of him. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in weeks." He paused, watching her with a thoughtful expression. "You?" She nodded, turning back to the kettle. "Yeah, it's quiet here now, isn't it?" "Feels like the house is finally settling in," he said, walking over to her. He stopped just behind her, his presence filling the space between them. "Feels like we are too." Natalie glanced over her shoulder, meeting his gaze. There was something in his eyes, something that had been building ever since that night on the porch. A quiet understanding, a recognition that, despite the mess of their pasts, they were building something together. Something new. "Yeah," she agreed, her voice soft. "It does." Liam reached out, his hand brushing against her arm. A simple gesture, but one that held more meaning than any words could. "I was thinking," he began, his tone hesitant, as if weighing his words carefully. "About the house. About us." Natalie turned to face him fully, her heart beating a little faster. "What about us?" He took a small step closer, the air between them charged with anticipation. "I know we've been through a lot. This house, the letters, all of it. But I don't want to keep looking back. I want to build something here. Together. I don't know what the future holds, but I'd like to find out with you." Natalie felt a smile tug at the corners of her lips, her chest full as she looked at him. His words were simple, but they were everything she had needed to hear. She had been so caught up in the past, so focused on the history of the house and the letters, that she had forgotten to consider the future. And now, with Liam standing before her, offering not just his help but his heart, the future seemed less daunting, less uncertain. "I'd like that too," she said softly, her voice steady now. "I want that." Liam smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that made her heart flutter. He reached for her hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "We've got time. Nat, time to figure it all out." And with that, something inside her shifted. The past, those letters, the house, everything that had led her here, faded into the background. She could see the future now, a future not bound by the shadows of history but shaped by what they could create together. They didn't have to have all the answers, didn't have to know exactly what came next. All that mattered was that they were moving forward, side by side. As the kettle whistled softly behind them, signaling the start of a new day, Natalie knew that this was only the beginning. There was still so much to discover, so much to experience, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready to embrace the life they would build in this house, this town, and in each other's hearts. The snow continued to fall outside, its quiet beauty a reflection of the peace Natalie had finally found within herself. The future was waiting for her, for them, and this time, she was ready to meet it head-on. Chapter 16. A Christmas Restored. The last few days before Christmas passed in a whirlwind, but unlike previous years, this December felt different to Natalie. The chill of the season no longer felt like an obstacle or something to endure. It had become something warm, something to embrace. Even the house, which had once seemed to hold the weight of countless untold stories, now felt alive with possibilities. There was a sense of peace, an understanding that had settled between Natalie and Liam, and it had begun to radiate through everything they did. The final touches had been added to the house. The last of the Christmas decorations hung in place. The garlands draped across the staircase banister, the stockings filled with small tokens of affection, and the tree, now adorned with twinkling lights and a star at its pinnacle. The house was everything she had hoped for and more. But it wasn't just the decorations or the restored rooms that made it feel like home. It was the people she shared it with. As the days grew shorter, with the winter sun retreating earlier each evening, Natalie found herself drawn closer to Liam. They spent quiet mornings together, drinking coffee and sitting in the parlor, sometimes in comfortable silence, other times talking about anything and everything. They spoke of their pasts, of memories both joyful and painful, and of dreams for the future. It was during these quiet moments that Natalie realized just how much they had come to depend on one another, not just for the house, but for the solace they had found in each other's company. It was just days before Christmas when Liam surprised her. After weeks of quiet moments, he came to her with a small package in his hands, wrapped in simple brown paper and tied with twine. Natalie had been in the kitchen, preparing a batch of cookies when he found her, standing in the doorway with a look of slight hesitation in his eyes. "Hey," he began softly, his usual calm demeanor tinged with something unspoken. "I've got something for you." Natalie looked up, the warmth of the oven filling the room and a smile tugging at her lips. She wiped her hands on a towel and walked over to him. "What's this?" Liam handed her the package, his fingers brushing against hers. The gesture was light, but there was something heavy behind it, something she couldn't quite place. As she untied the twine and unfolded the paper, her heart skipped when she saw what was inside. It was an old photograph, slightly faded at the edges, but still clear enough to see the smiling faces of two people, standing together under a large oak tree. The photograph was taken decades ago, long before Natalie had ever set foot in this town. But it wasn't just any photo. It was the photograph of the couple from the letters, the same faces that had been captured in the words they had uncovered together. She recognized them instantly. The woman was wearing a dress from the 1940s, the fabric delicate and soft, and the man stood beside her, his arm draped gently around her waist. They were standing together, their faces radiating a quiet happiness. And in the background, though slightly blurred, was the very same oak tree that stood in the yard outside. Liam had been quiet as she studied the photo, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jeans. Finally, he spoke. "I found it in a box of old photos at the library. I thought you might like it." Her fingers traced the edges of the photograph, and a deep sense of gratitude swelled inside her. This means a lot," she said, her voice catching unexpectedly. She had spent so long immersed in their story, in the mystery of the letters, that it was hard to believe it was all connected. The love story she had uncovered, the lives of these two people from the past, had become entwined with her own. And now, with Liam standing beside her, there was no denying it. They had become part of that same story. "I wanted you to have something that tied everything together," Liam said quietly, his voice soft but steady. "Not just the house, not just the letters, but everything we've found, everything we've become." Tears stung Natalie's eyes, though she wasn't sure why. There was something about this gift, the way it bridged the past and the present, that made everything feel so much more real. The love that had once filled these rooms, that had been preserved in the letters and the photograph, now felt alive again, and not just as a relic of the past. It was a love that had inspired their own, a love that had led them here, to this moment. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, blinking back the unexpected tears. "This is more than I could have ever asked for." Liam gave a small smile, his eyes warm with affection. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that you're not alone in all of this." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a sense of shared understanding, a connection that went beyond simple words. They were no longer two people caught up in the weight of their own histories. They were a part of something larger, something timeless, and together, they were creating something new. Natalie looked up at Liam, her heart swelling with emotion. "I don't think I could have done any of this without you." He reached for her hand, his fingers curling around hers, grounding her. "You didn't have to. We did it together." And in that simple, quiet moment, Natalie realized how far they had come. The house, the letters, the history, they were all just pieces of the puzzle. The real story, the one they had been writing all along, was the one they shared. It was the story of their connection, of the love that had blossomed between them in the midst of everything they had faced. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Christmas Eve arrived with a stillness in the air, the snow continuing to fall gently, blanketing the world in a soft, silvery glow. The house felt even more alive tonight, as though the weight of its history had been lifted and replaced with the warmth of new memories. There was a small fire burning in the hearth, casting a golden glow across the room. Outside, the Christmas lights twinkled against the darkening sky, and the sound of laughter filled the air as friends and neighbors gathered together. Liam and Natalie sat side by side, the photograph resting between them on the table, a reminder of everything they had uncovered, everything they had built. And as the clock struck midnight, signaling the arrival of Christmas Day, Natalie leaned her head against Liam's shoulder, her heart at peace. "I never thought I'd find a place like this," she murmured, her voice soft with contentment. Liam turned his head slightly, his lips brushing against the top of her head in a gesture that spoke volumes. "Me neither, but I'm glad we found it. Together." And in that moment, Natalie knew, without a doubt, that they had found something more than just a house. They had found a home not just in the walls of the Victorian house, but in each other. It was a place where the past and the present could coexist, where love, both timeless and new, could flourish. As the night wore on and the last of the guests departed, Natalie and Liam remained, wrapped in the quiet of the Christmas evening. They had started this journey together, unsure of where it would lead, but now, as they sat together in the warmth of the firelight, they both knew. The story they had uncovered was only the beginning of their own. The ties that bound them were stronger than ever, and the future, whatever it held, seemed as bright as the stars outside, shining through the snow-covered windows. And as the house settled into the stillness of the night, they knew that no matter what the future brought, they would face it together.